Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you another one of my versus video. Now, I want to give a little bit of a caveat before I dive in today's subject matter because I often don't like to do cross-platform comparisons. Now, I'm doing one today. It's primarily because I just happen to have the Sony 70 to 350 millimeter and the Fuji 70 to 300 millimeter at roughly the same time. And so I was able to do a few, cross-platform comparisons. But at the same time, you have to recognize that you really can't compare one lens directly to another when you can't put them on the same camera with the same sensor. And so when it comes to either autofocus performance or optical performance, there are factors that are introduced through the camera body that make this a little bit less than a scientific comparison. I also recognize that for many people, it's a moot point. If you own one camera system, you're very likely going to buy the lens that matches your camera system, but there are a few people that maybe own both platforms. Also some people who are debating what platform to buy into. And for you, this comparison may have some merit. And so we are going to do a dive into some strengths and weaknesses for both the Sony 70 to 350 millimeter f4.5 to 6.3 OSS and the Fuji XF 70 to 300 millimeter f4 to 5.6. And this is, it has their LM linear motor, it has OIS optical stabilizer, and it is weather resistant. And so it is really their closest comparison on these platforms. Both of them are really premium APS-C telephoto zooms for mirrorless cameras. So there is a lot of similarities on that front. So if you look at the basic specifications, let's just talk about how that they compare. First of all, when it comes to price, the Fuji comes in at about $800 while the Sony comes in at about $1,000. I did note when it comes to the Sony that its price is more competitive in other markets than actually it is in the US, which is a little bit of a rare turn of events. When it comes to the size, the Fuji in its retracted form is the more compact lens. It's 75 millimeters in diameter, 132.5 millimeters in length, and weighs 588 grams. All of those top the Sony by a little bit, which is 77 millimeters, so 2 millimeters wider. It's 142 millimeters, so about 9.5 millimeters longer. And it weighs 625 grams, so about 37 grams heavier, though you probably won't notice that in the field. But I did also note that the situation reverses when you begin to zoom out the lenses or you attach the lens hoods. And so if you zoom out the Fuji, it extends as far as 205 millimeters, whereas the Sony only extends out to 190 millimeters. So it's not as compact retracted, but it's a little more compact when it's zoomed out. And the lens hood on the Fuji is considerably deeper than the one found on the Sony. So which lens is more compact really depends on the state that you have it in at the moment. Obviously, the Sony is going to win when it comes to the basic zoom range. It starts at the same point, but it extends pretty important extra 50 millimeters out to 350 millimeters, which is really one of the defining characteristics of the Sony. It gives you a broader zoom range than what you typically find in such a lens. The Fuji, however, is the winner when it comes to the maximum aperture. And at basically all tested focal lengths, it has at least a little bit of an aperture value, starting at f4 versus f4.5, and of course, at the telephoto end of the range, it only reaches a maximum of f5.6 versus f6.3. So about a third stop throughout the range, there's going to be an advantage for the Fuji. So it's a slightly brighter lens when it comes to that. Another area where the Fuji and just the raw specs has a bit of an advantage is when it comes to its maximum magnification. It has a very useful 0.33 times magnification, which as you can see gives you a pretty tight framing. The Sony is a little bit wider, doesn't give you quite as much magnification at a 0.23 times magnification, so a win there for the Fuji. Both of them are weather sealed or weather resistant lenses, though I wasn't able to find a diagram that actually detailed where the seal points in the Fuji. I think Fuji's pretty confident about the weather sealing because even on their website they show it covered in raindrops. And then the Sony has 10 different seal points, so I know that it's a thoroughly sealed lens. Now obviously neither of these lenses are going to be water waterproof, so don't push it too far. But the very fact, as I said, that Fuji shows the lens wet shows that at the very least they're not afraid for the lens to be taken out into the elements. The same applies to the Sony. Whenever you put a diagram out there showing all the seal points, you are expressing some confidence in that. Both of them have optical stabilizers, OIS in the Fuji, OSS in the Sony, and I actually found, I would say, the performance of both to be quite similar, and that I was actually impressed with both. I was able to get good hand-holding results at anywhere between 5 and 6 stops of hand holdability, and so both of them are, I think fairly equal when it comes to that. Basic build quality, I would say, is pretty comparable. I wouldn't say that one stood out as better than the other. Let's talk about a few of the Sony strengths relative to the Fuji lens. So one of the Sony strengths is that I found the autofocus to be more responsive in that, and again, this is where some of that, crossover happens when it comes to the camera body. But I certainly found that in terms of focus, I had faster focus acquisition, and then I felt like I just had a little bit better overall focus speed and slightly quieter autofocus. So both lenses, there's not a lot of noise involved in the actual focus process. I did find the Sony a little bit more accurate, and again, it's hard for me to break that out. Just so you know, I primarily used a Sony a6400 with the Sony, Fuji XT4 with the Fuji lens, though I did also throw the Sony onto my Sony Alpha 1, which is of course in a whole other category of camera, and it really sung there. And so that is one advantage for Sony, in that their E-mount is both APS-C and full frame, and so it does give you access to some different camera bodies, but at the same time, I definitely just found that I preferred the focus action on the Sony, whatever the cause. The Sony is also a little bit sharper. It is a really incredibly sharp lens across the zoom range, and I also noted that I got a little bit more consistent sharpness out of the Sony because of that autofocus factor that I spoke about before. The Sony is also more consistent over the zoom range. It basically has very little drop off at any point in the zoom range. It's more consistent across the image circle than what the Fuji is. So in terms of sharpness, it's a winner on that. I also found that I preferred the layout of the controls for the Sony. It has a more traditional kind of bank of switches on it. It also has a focus hold button, which is a handy Sony feature. I found that the Fuji controls were very cramped, very close to the camera body, and so very hard to actually find by feel, and so I did prefer the control layout for the Sony, even though they basically have pretty similar, not identical but similar type controls. Some Fuji strengths that stood out to me is that I really felt like the Fuji delivered the more pleasing overall rendering. The colors were really, really beautiful out of it, and I would say I instinctively preferred the look of images compared to the Sony, even though I think that the Sony excelled more in the the technical department, and at a pixel level I like the Sony better. Just as a gut response to the images themselves, I preferred the Fuji and its rendering. I also felt that the Fuji had nicer bokeh, just a little bit more smooth, and while I didn't criticize in any way the bokeh from the Sony in my review, I just, again, it's more that instinctive reaction that I just felt like the bokeh and the subject separation was a little bit nicer on the Fuji. The Fuji also has an aperture ring, which not everybody cares about. I happen to prefer that as a more direct control over aperture, and so it was something that I actually preferred. Now, if you really want my whole feelings on either lens, I recommend that you either check out my thorough video review or text review of the Sony. I'll link to the text review in the description, or of the Fuji, and in both cases I'll link to those both of those there in the description as well. But I would say that while both of them have strengths and weaknesses, one is not necessarily wildly better than the other. It really depends on the system that you're more interested in at the end of the day. And while I think that the Sony, I would say, was the lens that I would probably end up preferring, mostly because I prefer the overall focus at the moment, the overall focus quality of the Sony, and thus I felt like it was a little bit more reliable. As I said, I actually preferred the overall look of images a bit more from the Fuji. And so at the end of the day, I really can't say here's one winner, here's one loser. I think that they're both very good lenses and they have different strengths. But what I would recommend to you is, I don't feel like I'm here to make decisions for you. I feel like I'm here to do my best to equip you to make a better decision. So hopefully what I've shared here gives you a little bit of a feel over which lens and then potentially which system is maybe more attractive to you. I'm Dustin Abbott, and as mentioned, if you'll look in the description down below, you can find links to my full coverage of both lenses, along with buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. Also linkage there to follow myself or Craig on social media, or check out our collaboration channel, Let the Light In TV. You can also find linkage to purchase some channel merchandise if you want to support the channel this way, or you can become a patron. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.